That's not my 44th speech. Fellow Toastmasters and welcome guests. I grew up on the Lower East Side in Manhattan, and when I was a young kid, my mom sent me to this Chinese Catholic church, not for religious reasons, but mainly for them so they can babysit me while she went to work. And I remember my experiences at this church. I went to Sunday school there. The people there taught me about prayer. They taught us how to pray before we ate, pray before we slept, pray before many, many different things. And I would play along with everyone and pray along with everyone. And I thought it was interesting. It was kind of nice. And then I stopped going to the church because my mom found another babysitter. And I spent the rest of my childhood growing up without prayer because I grew up in a traditional Chinese family, and my folks were not religious. They were pretty secular. They believed in working hard, making money, following your common sense, and just doing what works. So I grew up without prayer. What I learned in the church I quickly forgot, and I ultimately developed a belief. I was conditioned with this belief based on what I saw, my experiences, my family's influence, that prayer was for those who were weak. That's what I eventually came to believe. It was for the weak-minded, for the mentally, they couldn't help themselves. That's why they're praying for help from the outside. So I pretty much grew up with that conditioning. About 5 years ago, I started reading all these books about spirituality, religion, different practices, and that path culminated into a trip which I went on actually a month ago to India. It was a spiritual journey. It was affiliated with the Oneness University. It was not a religious thing, but it was more of a spiritual kind of training, kind of expanding your horizons. And among the many things I learned that I came across was prayer, again. And having experienced during my childhood that prayer was for the weak, and that's what I come to believe, the guys at the university started to explain to me what prayer was about. And they basically explained it, and this is prayer that's not affiliated with any religion. Actually, prayer among all the religions and all the different spiritual systems, really it functions on the same four principles. So they broke down what makes a prayer to me. And the first ingredient is intent. When we pray for something, we have to have a clear and strong intent. What are you praying for? A lot of times we pray for things like, I wish I had $1 million, but in the back of our minds, we don't really believe it. Who am I kidding? So a lot of times when we have an intent, or we think we have an intent, it's not fully aligned within us. It's actually in conflict because we're asking for something, but in our subconscious minds, we don't actually believe it's possible, so our intent is conflicted. So the key ingredient is to have a clear and focused and strong intent. The second ingredient to prayer is a strong emotion, a strong emotional charge, and that is what provides the power behind the prayer to make it work. The third ingredient is gratitude, being thankful in advance for something you're asking for. And the last ingredient is just to allow it to happen, to trust that it will happen and not think about it after you've placed your order, so to speak, to the universe. So this is how the guys explained it to me at the Oneness University, and I had a hard time with this. They were also telling me that I had to cultivate a relationship with the divine, just like cultivating a relationship with a stranger. If you're in a room with a stranger, how do you relate to that person? You have to start communicating, talking, relating. And over time, there's a back and forth communication, which strengthens into a relationship. And they explained to me how relating to the divine is really like relating to a person. It takes time, it takes cultivation. But still, I really had a hard time with this because I always thought that prayer was so unnecessary. I didn't really believe in it. And I went back to my dorm room and I laid on my bed thinking about what they had just told me, and I still had a hard time because to me, talking to the universe, praying, it seemed a little silly. It was almost like, am I going to talk into thin air and expect someone to talk back to me? It's kind of silly. I thought of it as a little child talking to his or her imaginary friend. So I lay on my bed, and I was thinking, contemplating it for a while, and I still couldn't get it. And I just said, whatever. I just forgot it, and I put on my headphones, turned on some music, and just vegetating on my bed, meditating. And the music I happened to be listening to was very moving, very touching. And after a while, I was in a state, I was very inspired by the music. It was moving, it was touching. It got me thinking about my life and all these things. And I started feeling really emotional for some reason. And I felt all these tingles down my body, goosebumps. And then I had a huge realization. At that moment, I was in a state of prayer. I was connected to the universe, and I felt it. I knew it. And it wasn't the way they explained it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal thing where you put your hands together and talk to whoever's up there. Everyone can pray in their own way. And I realized that at that moment, while listening to those songs, this had happened before. Every time in the past when I listened to music that was moving, when I was moved, my heart was open and I was inspired. That is a state of prayer. Every time I've seen a movie that inspired me or moved me to do something, I was also in a state of prayer. Every time I came across a situation, a person, anything that happened that moved me, I was in a state of prayer. I was open. I was emotionally inspired, charged, and in that moment, if I were to have an intent for something, it would happen. And on that bed in the dorm room, when I realized that I was in a state of prayer, I decided to try it. And I asked for some security and some stability in my work situation because I knew that I was struggling with my business and things weren't looking that great. And I prayed for some sort of stability, some sort of security. And would you know it, the next day I got an email while at the university with a job offer. So I was just pretty amazed. So ever since that moment, I've been experimenting with this prayer, those 4 ingredients. And things have been happening. Things have been manifesting. And I'm starting slowly to believe it more and more. Not because of what the guides told me or what teachings I heard, but because of my own experience, of my own testimony. So I would conclude with a metaphor that if all of us were computers, some of us have bigger hard drives, some of us have faster processors, some of us have more peripherals and more features, but no matter, even if you're a supercomputer, you're still no match for just an ordinary computer that is plugged into the internet. So prayer to me is like plugging into the internet. The universe is a source. It's an infinite source of inspiration, of energy, of ideas, of anything. And the universe is powerful. But we are also powerful. And what I've come across is, I think if we work side by side, not necessarily having to worship, not necessarily having to put down, but working side by side with a resource that's already there and tapping into it, I think our lives would be a lot more effective. So I invite you to give it a shot. It's not a religious thing. It's not even a spiritual thing. It's a practical thing. It's a resource that many of us are not tapping into, including myself in the past. So I invite you to plug in and talk to the universe. Mr. Toastmaster.